as Americans. In terms of the voting, it's a responsibility. If you're citizens of the United States and you're able to vote, you have a responsibility to vote to make your voice heard. And I also have information on here that's true, but in fact, oftentimes, state and local positions maybe have more of an impact on our daily life. So obviously this next presidential election is getting a lot of attention and it's a big deal, but I always encourage people to think about the ways in which local elections also impact their lives, and encourage people to think about state and local elections and voting, and not just voting every 4 years. So let's see if there's anything in the chat that's relevant. I want to keep it open in case people have questions. You can ask them through the chat. I opened it. It looks like the chat had issues around the interpreter and making sure things were smooth there. But I'll keep checking the chat to make sure that nothing comes up that I need to answer. So again, presidential elections getting a lot of attention. It's very important, but don't forget about those local elections, because oftentimes they have an ability to affect our daily lives even more than a presidential election. So some of you may be wondering, who is eligible to vote? Are you eligible to vote? Now this presentation, I'm going to go over some important pieces about eligibility, but I do want to note that the deadline to register to vote has passed. We still have a lot of deadlines in front of us, so there's still a lot of information in this presentation that will be useful that you need to know in terms of deadlines. But if you haven't registered to vote yet, the deadline is passed. But to be eligible, the questions are you a US citizen? Are you at least 18? Whether or not you're currently serving a sentence for being convicted of a felony, and are you under guardianship? Now the guardianship provision doesn't mean you're automatically not eligible to vote. You can be under guardianship and still be eligible as long as the judge has deemed it so. So if the judge says that you are under guardianship but hasn't taken away vote and you're under guardianship, then you can either petition the judge, and Disability Rights Texas could help with this, but to try to get the voting restriction taken off of your guardianship. So just because you're under guardianship doesn't mean you can't vote. That's the one that can change. In terms of the, being under 18, well, if you're 17, if you're 16, you're not able to vote yet. So of course you need to register to vote. Like I mentioned, the deadline to register has already passed, but this has basic information about how to register to vote. You have to fill out an application and then you have to mail it. Once it's approved, so once everything is verified, you receive a voter registration card in the mail that looks like what's here on the PowerPoint, this yellow card. And that'll have your voter ID number, the precinct that you have, as well as how long the voter registration is valid. So if you don't receive, if you tried to register to vote and you haven't received the application, the approval in the form of the voter registration card, you can call your county elections official to find out what the status is. But again, in order to vote, you of course have to be registered, fill out the application, and you wait to get your voter registration card. So in terms of now you're registered, you've done the steps, what's next? Well, you get to decide that. You get to decide what is important to you to vote for, what issues you want to pay attention to. Voting impacts a lot of issues that people with disabilities face, including education, what services you receive, transportation, housing, Medicaid, Medicare, and employment. And so there's a whole host of issues that are specific to people with disabilities, and then there's a whole bunch of universal issues that are universal to everybody. And so you get to decide and you get to do your research to figure out which those issues are. How do you learn about the issues and candidates? I have a couple pictures here that talk about different ideas of looking at the newspaper, the television, going on the internet, watching debates, or also just talking to friends and getting input that way. So there's a lot of different ways to learn about the issues and the candidates once you've decided what's important to you. And then the last step, and there's still a lot more to this presentation, don't worry, but the last step is to go vote. So you've registered, you've learned about what is important to you, you've researched. Now the next step is to go vote. That's the part that can be complicated. It can be difficult for some people for various reasons. And so what I'm hoping this presentation does is it helps you learn and make a plan about voting to try to figure out the best way for you to do it and kind of get all of the resources and accommodations you may need to vote. So you have the right under the law to certain accommodations as a person with a disability. You have the right to special machines, and we'll talk more about those. Well, actually, we can talk a little bit about them right now. To curbside voting, which we will talk about in a moment, mail-in ballots, and then you also have the right to a support system, a support person. Let's talk first about the special machines. The two primary special machines that we are thinking of are, one, a machine that helps somebody who has a visual impairment or who is blind read the material on the voting machine. So it's basically a screening software that has a way for a voter to information on the ballot can be read to the voter, and the voter can access all the information just as a sighted person might. A voting machine, an accessible voting machine at every polling location, so that somebody who has a visual impairment or who's blind can access a ballot at every voting location. So people who have a visual impairment or are blind already know usually about this, and they know that they can bring their own headphones or they have headphones for use. And sometimes the poll workers are not always trained on it, and so that can be a challenge. Sometimes the machines are not working. So these are all issues that Disability Rights Texas looks at, and if you have these issues, you can give us a call, and our contact information is going at the end. But the special machines for a person blind or a visual impairment is one example. And then the other is something called a sip and puff machine. And there's a picture of that in the lower right-hand corner of the screen that shows a man using a sip and puff machine. And that's for somebody who may have paraplegia or quadriplegia and has limited use of their arms or of their body. And so they vote using this machine in which they sip or puff into the machine to move the screen forward and to make their selections. There's also voters who may use their feet to vote, as to not use the sip and puff machine. There's other options as well, but you have a right to an accommodation that would allow you to vote how you need to. So the support person, it can be anybody, but it cannot be your employer, but it could be a family member, a friend, or it can also be a poll worker. So somebody who's actually at the polling location helps you. They're obligated to read you the whole ballot, and they can explain the ballot to you. But of course, they cannot tell you how to vote. There's also curbside voting, which, like I said, we'll talk about in a moment. And then the big one that everybody's talking about this year is mail-in ballots. In order to vote, the question, what do I need to bring with you? So many of you may have heard about the issues around voter ID. Texas used to not require voter ID. And the only thing that you had to prove was that your copy of your voter registration, which of course proved that you were registered to vote. That has changed, and now Texans are obligated to bring a form of photo ID, which can be disproportionately hard on people with disabilities that may not have an ID for various reasons. So it can be especially difficult, and this relatively new rule can be especially difficult on Texans with disabilities. But you have to have one of the forms of ID, a driver's license, a Texas ID card, an election identification certificate, a handgun license, military license, and you can also use different federal IDs like a US passport. And you know what, I'll mention this, I'm gonna go back on the slide real quick because I see that there's one thing written on this slide in the lower right-hand corner. It says, you can bring a cheat sheet and/or a support person. And I mentioned when we were talking about the last slide that the support person is anybody that you want. You're allowed to bring that person with you. But you can also help bring in a cheat sheet that has things that you may have written down to help you remember, or a sample ballot that you filled out that also help you remember. That's allowed. So that is something that you can bring with you. You can have something written and take it with you to the voting booth if you need it. In terms of the voter ID, this lists, again, the types of voter ID that are acceptable. But it's important to know that some of this, a lot of people have questions about, well, I have an ID, but it's expired. Is that okay? Yes, it is, but it cannot be expired for more than 4 years. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. If you do have an ID, but it's expired, that's acceptable, but just make sure it's not expired for more than 4 years. Okay, and I'm looking at the questions. So I have 3 questions. I'll take them in order. The first is, can I be 17 and 8 months and be eligible or no? So that has to do with when the election is. You do have to be 18 on the date of election. So you cannot vote until you are 18, but you can register in anticipation of being 18 on election day. Somebody asked, where can I get an application for the next election? And I wonder, I'm not sure what that question asked, but I wonder if that's for how do I register to vote for the next election? So understanding that, this election, the deadline is passed to register, but where can I get an application to register for the next election? And that's available on the Secretary of State's website. There's going to be some links in the PowerPoint to the Secretary of State's website. And then, I'm sorry, the additional chats are coming up, so that's great. I'm excited to see the questions. So if you go to the Secretary of State's website, there should be information about how to register to vote there. Like I said, for this particular election, it's too late, but you can register for the next election date. So somebody else asked, do I have to present any proof for my disability in order for my aide or to be with me or to have notes with me in the voting booth? No, you do not. All you need to do is say that you need the assistance and it's for reason of disability, but you do not need to say anything about what your disability is to prove your disability. You don't need to have any sort of proof with you. Somebody else asked that I have what assistance is available. So you're able to, of course, take whoever you need to be with you if you have a friend or family member, but if you don't, somebody who is at the polling location, a poll worker or staff, can help read the ballot to you. If you also potentially use screen reading software, you can use the device and use the accessible voting machine that has a headphone jack and then have the ballot be read to you and fill it out that way, if that's something you're familiar with or comfortable with. Either one you're able to use depending on what your preference is. Somebody says you can vote early if you're 18 on election day. That's correct, yes. And I think maybe the way that I stated it was unclear. Yes, so it's not that if you're 18 on election day, it's that if you're 18 on election day, yes, but you can still vote early so long as you will be 18 on election day. That's correct. Okay, those are all very good questions, and I hope I answered them adequately. If I didn't, re-ask them or clarify, and I'll see if I can answer them a little bit better, but those were all very good questions. So in terms of voter ID, if you don't have any of these types of voter ID, you're able to sign a declaration called an impediment declaration for somebody with a disability, and also present some other form of your name and address. And the examples here are the valid voter registration certificate, so that little postcard that we just looked at, a birth certificate, a utility bill with your name and address, a bank statement, government check, or paycheck. But what you have to do is you have to present that and also fill out this form, which is a impediment declaration, and the voter has to fill it out on the day of voting if you're not able to get a voter ID or not bring in an ID to vote. And then it has to be sworn and subscribed by the presiding judge, which will be done when the judge receives it. Okay, so curbside voting. As I had said earlier, I was going to talk about curbside voting separately because curbside voting is something that people sometimes are not familiar with or not don't know if they're eligible or they've never done it. But curbside voting is a good option for people who are physically unable to enter the polling place without personal assistance or without the likelihood of injuring your health. I say that specifically because that's what's written in the election code. Specifically, the election code says you're eligible to vote by curbside if you are physically unable to enter the polling place without personal assistance or a likelihood of injuring your health. That's who's eligible for curbside. Basically what curbside is they bring a ballot out to you. They bring a mobile voting booth with the ballot out to you. It's available during early voting and on election day, and they bring it to, as curbside, usually they would bring it to your car. And it's, once you mark the ballot, you mark it just as normal. You get to the election officer, and then the election officer will put it into the ballot box. But if you prefer somebody with you, a companion, they may also put it in for the ballot box for you. Every location is supposed to have a curbside voting machine that's able to come out to the curbside, but it's still a good idea to call in advance if you're able to find out and notify that you're going to want curbside voting. That's not required, but that could save you some time. So call your county election official and let them know you want to vote and what your precinct number is if you're going to a specific precinct. And the county election official will then notify the poll workers there and let them know that you're going to be coming in to vote curbside. Here's a link if people want to write it down, because this link has a list of all of the county election officials by county. Obviously, I know people are in Dallas, but there's a lot of counties in the surrounding areas. So you can identify your specific county election official by looking at that link on the Secretary of State's website. And that has contact information that it's not only about calling to let them know or ask questions about curbside voting, but about everything, about making sure your voter registration is current, or making sure that your ballot by mail is already in the mail and coming to you, and things of that nature. Okay, so the next big question is, what is vote by mail? And this is something that probably a lot of people have thought about or heard about for this election. Vote by mail means that you can get a ballot mailed to you, you mark it out, and then you return it also by mail to be counted. There's an option as well to drop it off at your county elections office. And I'll talk about that, I think, in a little bit. But you don't fill it out by email, you don't fill it out online, it's not sent back electronically. It either has to be mailed back or you have to drop it off in person at one location in your county. Now, the important thing about this is that ballots must be received by 7 p.m. on election day. And that's tricky because we don't know exactly how long things take to get it through the mail. So the sooner you send it, the better. Because if you mail it on election day, it's unlikely it's going to get received there by 7 p.m. on election day. So if you're mailing your ballot, just make sure you're mailing it with advance time so that it can be received by 7 p.m. on election day. This is not a postmark deadline, and that can be very confusing or difficult to guarantee. So make sure that you're mailing your mail-in ballot with plenty of time to be received by 7 p.m. on election day. Who is eligible to vote by mail? This is a big question, and there was a lot of litigation about this very question and issue. You're eligible to vote if you're going to be away from your county on election day and also during early voting. Early voting started today. Maybe everybody already knows that. I hope so. It's very exciting. So if you are on this Zoom from somewhere else in the country and not in your county, and you're going to be away all the way to election day, you'd be eligible to vote by mail. If you are sick or have a disability, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, you're also eligible to vote by mail. If you're 65 years of age or older on election day, also eligible. And also if you're confined in jail, but you are still eligible to vote, then you can vote by mail. So the disability provision is that the actual definition is that you have a disability if you have a sickness or physical condition that prevents the voter from appearing at the polling place on election day without a likelihood of needing personal assistance or injuring the voter's health. There's not a lot of clarity about what this means. We've gotten a couple of clues through the litigation, but there's not a lot of like very clear, precise definitions aside from what I just read to you. Disability Rights Texas takes the position that under current state and federal law, that if you have a medical condition that puts you at a higher risk if you were to contract COVID-19, then you're eligible to vote by mail because you have a high-risk condition, and that has a likelihood of injuring your health if you were to catch COVID-19 at the voting site. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, I think, in a moment too. In order to get a ballot by mail, you have to apply. So you have to apply, and the deadline is October 23rd. And this, again, is a receipt deadline. They have to receive your application to vote by mail by October 23rd. So that's coming up. Everybody, I hope, that wants to vote by mail has already submitted their application to vote by mail. You send in the application to your county clerk's early voting office. And then again, here's another way to get the name and address of the early voting clerk. You can call the Secretary of State's office at 1-800-252-8683. And you can also go online, and there's a link here that's listed, and you can get the application mailed to you. But you have to apply, and if you don't apply, you won't be able to vote by mail. Again, the deadline is October 23rd, and you have to have that as a receive deadline. Okay. Can I ask someone to help me fill out the application? Yes, of course. The application to vote by mail is relatively straightforward, but some people may need help either because they have a visual impairment, and there's no online form. The only way to do it is to fill it out and then sign it yourself. So people who have visual impairment or are blind may need help filling out the application to vote by mail. But yes, you can absolutely have help, and you want to find somebody who can help fill it out. You also, though, do have to write that person's name and address next to your signature on the application. And the person has to sign. This is COVID-19 and ballot by mail questions, because this is what people really, I think, got confused about or unsure about for understandable reasons. The guidelines remain the same, so nothing has changed about who's eligible. So 65, disability, illness, will be out of the country or confined in jail. Those are still the same. The definition over the Texas Election Code, which I talked about a moment ago, that's still the same. The questions people had are, at some point, one of the arguments that were made in a big lawsuit was, is a fear of contracting COVID-19 or is a lack of immunity to COVID-19, is that considered a disability? So if you are not immune to COVID-19, can that potentially be considered a disability under the election code? The state Supreme Court decided that no, lack of immunity to COVID-19 is not considered a disability under the election code. But the state Supreme Court did kind of give a little bit of clarity that helped to understand. And they said basically that voters are responsible for making the determination to deciding whether or not they're eligible under this definition. So the voter decides whether or not they have a disability that prevents them from appearing in person, or whether they need personal assistance. In addition, you don't have to give proof or explain anything about your disability. If you check the disability box, you don't have to say anything more. If you have a disability and you need to vote by mail because of your disability, then you check the disability box on the application to vote by mail, and then that's that. Okay, so voting plan checklist. Let's go over this so that we can all have a voting plan for election, early voting or election day. First, am I registered? I hope the answer to that question is yes, so that you can vote in this election. If the answer is no, then you need to register, and you can do that for the next election. So find out first whether you're registered. You can use, one way to do that is to find your voter registration card to see if it's valid, to see how, when it expires. You can also call your county clerk to find out and verify your registration. Then you want to decide, how are you going to vote? Are you going to vote in person, or are you going to vote by mail? Are you going to vote early, or are you going to wait till election day? If you're voting early or in person, you want to locate places that you can vote. So that'll be how you decide, where you're going to go. But in terms of voting by mail, you have to do another step, and that's important, and that's that you have to request your ballot. You have to apply to vote by mail so that you get a ballot. And then you got to say, okay, well, when will I vote? You're going to find a day and time. And this is really important. If you just put it on your calendar, figure out ahead of time when it's going to be so that you are sure to do it. Find out where, location, find out how to get there. Are you going to need a ride? Can you drive yourself? Are you going to take the bus? What are the bus routes? These are all things you have to consider. The sample ballot, a lot of counties offer sample ballots either on paper that you can use, some of them have them on their website. That way you can go on and see what your ballot's going to look like so that you'll know ahead of time what you're going to be voting for and what decisions you'll make. Think about whether you need assistance. Do you have to take somebody with you? Should you ask a family member or a friend? Make sure that their schedules match with yours so that you can go there. But also, if not, and you want to use a poll worker, make sure that you are able to ask for poll workers assistance when you get there. Same with the accommodation. Do you need any accommodations in order to vote? Maybe an assistant, so think about that. And then the question, who can I bring with me to vote? Again, anybody that you need to help you vote is able to go with you, as long as it's not your employer. Okay, I'm gonna stop for a moment because I'm getting towards the end of my presentation, and I'm gonna look at some of the chat questions that I think came in. Oh, this is very useful. Yes, so I am seeing that in the chat functions that I hope everyone can see, there are some links specifically for Dallas County that one are just kind of Dallas County information about where the early voting locations are. And also you can see if they've received your ballot on the Dallas County voting website. It looks like the chat says it's dallascountyvotes.org. And then also there's a link to the Texas Secretary of State's office where you can request your application to vote by mail if you're wanting to vote by mail. So those are very useful. If you're able to access the chat, go ahead and look now, because there are really useful links in there to the Secretary of State's website and also to Dallas County specifically. So in terms of the deadlines, the voter registration deadline, like I explained, has passed. It was October 5th. The application to vote by mail application must be received by October 23rd. Early voting started today, October 13th, and goes until October 30th. And then again, ballot by mail return deadlines, November 3rd, which is election day, by 7 p.m. And election day is November 3rd, which is a Tuesday, as always. Somebody asked, what if I can't verify that Dallas County received my ballot? Can I vote on election day, or will they tell me that I already voted? So I'm assuming this is an example in which you've mailed in your ballot and there's not a verification that they received it. And you're asking if you can re-vote on election day. I would caution against that, but try to see if you can, mail your ballot in plenty of time so that it arrives. But Dallas County should be able to tell you whether or not your ballot has arrived. So you should continue to call them and find out whether or not they've received your ballot. So I am not Molly Broadway. Molly Broadway is our training specialist, and this is her contact information because she's the one that really does most of the voter outreach. So I encourage you to give her a call with questions. But if you want to get somebody as quickly as possible and you have a question, here's our voting hotline number, and it's 1-888-796-VOTE. And this is a hotline that is available throughout early voting from 7 a.m. to, I believe, 8 p.m. And anytime you have a question, or if it's usually answered live. So if you're at a polling site and you have a question that is a live question and you want to get an answer right away, We are answering the voting hotline during early voting and on election day in real time. So you'll hopefully get an answer very quickly. Again, that number is 1-888-796-VOTE. But if you have kind of more technical questions or something that's not as urgent, Molly Broadway would be a good contact. She's our voting training and technical support specialist, and that is her phone number. So let's see. I think another question may have come in. Yes, it's our phone number in the chat feature, so I appreciate that. Okay, well, I will, let's see, turn it back to that screen if I can. There we go. I will take any other questions that people have right now. Like I said, hopefully my presentation covered a lot. And maybe there aren't that many questions that weren't covered, but I always miss something. So please ask me your questions, or if there was a lack of clarity on anything I said, it just was kind of confusing, let me know. I'm happy to answer them.
I wanted to ask, I have profound deafness, and with everybody wearing a mask, it's difficult to read lips, and I do not know ASL because I just read lips. So what kind of accommodations could I ask for, and would that qualify me to vote by mail?
Okay, so a couple of things. That brings up a lot of questions, or a lot of issues. The first, and this is, I'm not making any sort of kind of statement on wearing a mask, but the mask order that Governor Abbott mandated in the state of Texas, the voting polling location is exempt from wearing a mask. So people don't have to wear a mask in polling locations. You know, that's concerning, I think, because, you know, polling locations can be crowded, but that's one thing that I think is important for people to know as it relates to voting, that masks are not required at polling locations per the governor's order. It's one of the only parts of the state that are exempt from it. But certainly people can and have the option of wearing masks. And so hopefully we see a lot of people wearing masks. But what you're mentioning, Alicia, is that means that you won't be able the way that the vote by mail disability definition is written is it says if you need personal assistance with appearing at the voting location. And so some people are interpreting that to mean that if you need help getting to the polling location, then that means that you need personal assistance. They're not interpreting it to mean what happens when you're already there. So again, you know, that's frustrating because the definition has not been clarified by the state of Texas very well. There's still a lot of confusion about who's eligible. But I'm giving you that information about the idea is probably that it's about if you need help getting to the polling location as opposed to help once you're there. So I would assume that the best way to communicate, and it's not a good way to communicate, but in that situation is potentially to write back and forth as an accommodation, and they do have to provide that. That's not ideal. I don't know hardly any client who is deaf or hard of hearing that prefers to write back and forth. But given this situation, I think that might be one accommodation that you might ask for if you need it, and that they'd be required to give you. I saw two additional questions come into the chat. One is about, I need my supportive animal, and do they allow them in the voting booth? So you say supportive animal, and that can mean a variety of things. If it's a service animal, so a dog or a miniature horse, either of which are specifically trained to assist a person with a disability with one or more tasks, then yes, a service animal is required to be allowed to enter any polling location. So if you have a service animal, absolutely, the service animal can go with you. An emotional support animal does not have the same protections under the law. And so I don't know exactly what was asked by supportive animal, but an emotional support animal has rights in housing, in the housing context, but they don't have the same rights in the kind of public spaces that we think of, like city and state and government buildings, or also places like HEB or movie theaters. Emotional support animals don't have that protection. Service animals, a dog or a miniature horse that is specifically trained to assist a person with disability with tasks, yes, they are allowed in the voting booth. Somebody asked about whether or not being in the hospital would count as a sickness and would they be able to vote by mail? Yes, if you're in a hospital during early voting and election day and you're not able to vote, you would be eligible to vote by mail, absolutely. Are there any other questions I can answer? I've been really impressed with all the questions and also the folks who have been putting the links in the chat function. That's been very helpful. So thank you for doing that. Okay, well, I'm happy to answer any other questions. I realize that I guess I don't have my contact information anywhere here, and I apologize for not putting it in the PowerPoint, but I can tell it to you now, but also if you want to put it in a chat feature, that's another good way to contact me if you have follow-up questions. Though, you know, Molly is she'd be a great resource and might be able to answer the questions a little bit quicker than I would, or our voting rights hotline. We always are very excited to get calls on our voting rights hotline, not because we want people to be having problems, but we're certainly happy to answer things in real time because we want to give voters the best information that they can get. Okay, so let's see, maybe there's another chat. Somebody says, can I get a copy of your checklist? And let me verify what checklist. I assume maybe we're talking about this one, the voting plan checklist. I'm happy to provide the PowerPoint, or Alicia, I guess you have a copy of it. If you want to send it out to anybody, you're welcome to do that if you have people's contact information, because this PowerPoint can be shared. That's no problem.
I would be happy to send it out to everyone.
Okay. Okay, and actually, I guess I can put my contact information in the chat. There we go. Okay, so now my contact information is in the chat for everyone. It's ldavis@drtx.org, and it's in the chat. Certainly happy to answer questions as well. Okay, well, again, I mean, we can hang out. I know maybe we expected it to be about an hour and we're done maybe about 15 minutes early, but I'm happy to hang out to see if people have additional questions, but whatever we think is the best. Yes, somebody recommends the League of Women Voters of Dallas has a lot of information on their website. And I agree. Yeah, the League of Women Voters always has good information. I think it's written in a clear way. It's understandable. So if you want to visit the League of Women Voters website, I definitely think that's a good idea. I encourage that.
Thank you for joining us, Leah. Thank you for doing the presentation. It's very informative. And thank you, Russell and Susan, for providing the accommodations. I really appreciate it. And if there's no other questions, then I assume we can go ahead and end the meeting. If that's okay with everyone. If you have more questions, please add them in the chat, or if you want to be, if you need to raise your hand and unmute, that way you can ask the question, just let us know.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.
Okay.